Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. Herman Bell and two other members of a radical group called the Black Liberation Army ambushed a pair of New York City police officers back in 1971 and shot them to death. One of the officers was tormented as he begged for his life before he was finally killed. 3 months later, Bell also murdered a San Francisco police officer. He was finally captured, convicted, and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Now, nearly half a century after those killings, Bell, who spent nearly 45 years behind bars, has been granted parole. Not surprisingly, that decision by the New York State Board of Parole has set off a firestorm of controversy with passionate voices on both sides. Bell is now 70 years old, and his case has also put a spotlight on the issue of elderly and often gravely ill prisoners who remain incarcerated. There are a lot of them, and they are a big problem for the penal system. We'll talk about all of this with my guest, Michael Jacobson, the Executive Director of the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance, and Elizabeth Gaynes, who is President of the Osborne Association, an organization that aids people caught up in the criminal justice system and their families. Guys, welcome. Thank you so much for coming in. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Well, I'll start with Michael and then go immediately to Elizabeth on this question. Should Herman Bell be released from prison?
Well, I mean, I think he should because the parole board decided to release him. He was sentenced under a sentencing scheme where the law both anticipated the possibility of parole. The judge understood that he was sentencing him to a range where he was parole eligible. And 45 years down the road, the parole board thought, based on his behavior, based on the sort of relationship between punishment and rehabilitation and dignity, and in the public safety interest, it was time for him to be paroled. So I get the sort of passion on both sides of this, but parole boards are supposed to do exactly this, sort of put the sort of passion or sort of toxicity aside and make a reasoned judgment. And they made it, agree with it or disagree with it. And I think that decision has to be respected.
He was given a sentence which made him qualify eventually for parole. And you're right, I mean, the law was properly followed. Do you agree with the decision?
You know, it's hard to tell in any one case. You know, these kinds of crimes are they're both heinous and emotional, right? So in any particular case, where in this case he killed police officers and people kill children, right? I mean, people do all sorts of horrible things. And I think, you know, if you have some sort of belief in some fundamental nature of human dignity and rehabilitation, it has to be more than just a sort of philosophical and ephemeral concept that you believe in. You know, so even something as heinous as this act, there should be the possibility 5 decades down the road, right? Public safety isn't an issue now. The amount of punishment isn't an issue. He's been hugely punished. That people who even do the worst possible thing should live with some hope and dignity and the ability at some point to be free. So I get the decision. You know, if you're asking me what I would do if I was on the parole board, you know, I don't know. I like to think I would make a case on the merits. And not try to be so impacted by certainly the fear of the political blowback, which we're seeing now. So it's a tough decision. I get that, but this is what parole is for, to make these kinds of decisions in these kinds of cases.
Elizabeth.
Well, I think it's clear that he was ready for parole, and based on guidelines, this guy's been to parole board 7 times, and the guidelines now frame it as you can't just hold somebody based on the original crime. It has to do with remorse and rehabilitation, their behavior in prison, what kind of risk they pose. This is a man who poses zero risk of further crime. He has
Do we know
fully,
that?
in my opinion, yes, we do. In addition to their algorithmic risk assessments, he's not done one thing wrong in this whole time. We've seen plenty of opportunities. And he didn't even fight back when he was assaulted by correction officers recently for no reason, when they took him to a place with no cameras, mostly to try to get a charge on his record so that he wouldn't get parole. And he was found to be in the right. So yes, we know that he poses, well, first of all, almost nobody at that age poses any risk. The biggest risk is that when the PBA went on the air after this, they basically put a target on his back and almost said that they should kill him on sight. He has accepted responsibility. He's changed his life. He's done everything we ask people to do. That's what parole is supposed to do. What it is not supposed to do is be influenced by a political campaign designed to terrify parole board commissioners for doing their job. In addition, this happens routinely only when police are the victims in this case. And in my view, they gin up. It's so unfair. We're not concerned about the victims. These police officers had wives and families. And as a culture, we seem to prefer to march them out every 2 years rather than give them the kind of support that they should be getting to heal after an event like this. Every person who loses a child or a husband is horribly harmed by that. We know that. But prison is supposed to be for a particular purpose, and it is not perpetual punishment.
I think Liz's point, which is an important point to make, is that the parole board does not and should not have the ability to reject parole simply on the basis of the original charge, right? That's the rule. And once that's the rule, then they need to look at what they need to look at, which is all the things that she's gone through, and they made their decision, right? The argument people are making is based on the original crime. No one who ever does this should get parole. Well, that's
the arguments that they're making. That's correct.
Argument.
And I understand that the parole board is following legitimate guidelines and the law. But the folks who are opposed to the release, you're correct. They're making, and that includes Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo, but also a lot of people who are not politicians.
Right.
They're arguing that there should not be parole in this kind of a case, that the crime was so heinous that the criminal should not be parole eligible. And I have spent a lifetime being a pretty liberal reporter and commentator, and I am inclined to personally agree with that. I would not have granted.
So you support the death penalty?
I would not have
because that's
granted.
What you're talking about.
That's not what I'm talking about. No,
yes,
no,
you
no.
are. You're talking about people can't get out.
We have to stop here. You cannot say publicly that I support the death penalty.
I'm asking you.
There is an entire body of work of mine vehemently opposing the, just one second, please, let me say this, vehemently opposing the death penalty. I don't want any suggestion going out there that I support the death penalty. I do not. What I support, and I have made the argument, and this was a question I was going to ask in this program, I have argued a lot of time, for a long time, that in opposition to people who do support the death penalty, you can make the argument that you don't need to have the death penalty, you don't need to kill people to protect the public, that one of your alternatives is life without parole. I am in favor, in some very hideous crimes, of life without parole. I am not in favor of the death penalty. So please don't make that suggestion on this show or anywhere else.
I apologize, Mr. Herbert, but my point is that if he can never come home and has to die in prison, it is a form of a death penalty. I respect your position and I share it with regard to the death penalty. What I'm saying is that the law right now doesn't allow for that. Right now, the law under which this man was sentenced and the law of, in my opinion, people who care about rehabilitation and redemption says that there's a point at which people need to be considered. And when we start, and I don't mean you, when we start basically threatening parole commissioners, that they are supposed to bend to public pressure rather than look at the factors and the law that they are looking at, I think we've then given up on having a fair system.
Well, I'm certainly not in favor of that, but I do think that the argument about whether for some crimes parole should not be an option, I think is a legitimate public issue to be discussed.
And do you think it would be just because the 3 people that were killed were police officers?
No, absolutely,
So
absolutely not.
So would it be for any 3 people killed?
No, it would depend on the circumstances.
Exactly.
It would depend on the circumstances of the crime. But I can imagine easily where a person kills 3 people who were not police officers. I can easily imagine me taking the position that that person should not ever be released from prison.
But those people are being released from prison.
I
every
believe
day.
people, for example, in these school shootings that killed so many children, I would not be in favor of the death penalty for them, which is a tough position to take, but I certainly would not be in favor of them ever being
Right,
released
but
from
let's
prison.
get back to the situation where, in fact, we're not creating sentencing for the future. Right now, we say people can be redeemed.
But
when they take remorse,
this
responsibility,
discussion
and he's
would
met
be,
but
this discussion might well have an effect on sentencing for the future. That's why I think it is an important discussion.
So let's pick up on that point, because I think this is an important point to make. Right now, in most states, certainly in New York, right, that we have a different sentencing scheme now in New York than we did when he got sentenced. Right, so right now, people convicted of violent crimes in New York get determinate sentences. Right? There is no early parole release. So if he or anyone like him committed that kind of crime, we wouldn't be having this argument. You might argue over should he get X amount of time versus Y amount of time, or life without parole or not, right? But this case, in fact, is one of the reasons why states have elected to go from indeterminate sentences with the possibility of parole to just straight determinate sentences. And so if he was sentenced now, I don't know what a sentence would be exactly, but it would be either, it could be life without parole, it could be 35 years. And then people calculate good time, and then you're released. So everyone knows when you go in exactly when you're going out. And that takes this particular really emotional issue off the table. It is one of the reasons why, I mean, I myself have gone back and forth on this issue, because I as a criminologist, I like the idea of indeterminate sentencing, because people change in prison. You want to be able to say after 20 years you should get out. The problem is parole has become so politicized, because of blowback for cases like this. That people err on the side of not paroling, and parole rates go down when there's gubernatorial elections. So states have just moved to, when you're sentenced for a crime, here's what you're going to get, and that's it. And that's what exists now in New York. So the law has already been changed. If he committed this crime now, 40 years from now, this wouldn't be an issue. He'd either be in prison or out, but there is no parole for violent offenders in New York anymore.
So the Herman Bell case calls to mind the Judith Clark case. And Judith Clark was involved in the Brinks robbery, I think it was 1981. 2 cops were killed in that case, and also the Brinks guard was killed. Judith was a getaway driver in that case, did not kill anyone. She's been in prison for an incredibly long time and has been denied parole. Your thoughts on a comparison and comparing those 2 cases?
Well, one, it's interesting that the police had exactly the same response, although she wasn't the shooter, as the case in Herman's case. In both cases, the parole board is not supposed to resentence people. They are supposed to make those determinations. People change. It's about redemption. We're about to go into the Passover Easter season, when if any time in the world we ought to understand what redemption and rehabilitation and change means, and forgiveness and mercy, and why violence exists in our culture on so many levels. And you don't see the police up in arms when a police person kills an unarmed black man in the street. But for Judy Clark, who drove a car they are as vehement about keeping her. The difference
But
in the
I don't
outcome
want this
is
to
because
just be
there
a
were-
discussion of the police response, though. I understand that the police response is always the same.
There would
So
be
could
no
we just take
response
that?
otherwise.
Could we just take that off the table?
Sure.
There are people other than police officers
Right.
who think that Herman Bell should not be released from prison, and there are people on both sides of the Judith Clark issue who are not police officers. So
Correct.
it's not simply the fact that police officers have a politicized response.
Yeah.
How do you compare the two cases, and what do you think should happen in the Judith Clark
I think
case?
the big factual difference between the two is one was a shooter and
Right.
one was
not.
Still both incredibly serious cases, right? Heinous charges. And again, you have, I don't know the incredible details of the Judith Clark case, although by all accounts she's been a model prisoner, she's been in for decades. And again, on the face of it, she would meet the requirements for parole. This is what parole is supposed to do, both, as Liz is saying, look at issues of redemption, ownership and responsibility, public safety, and balance that out. And if you're not making a parole decision, again, based on the instant charge in case years ago, that's what you have to take into account. So for me, I understand why she's not getting parole, and the way I understand why a lot of people don't get parole, but she seems to me to be the quintessential person to get parole, even given the heinous act she was involved in decades ago.
But doesn't it seem like something's out of whack with the criminal justice system and the parole system specifically if Judith Clark, who killed no one, is kept in prison, and Herman Bell, who killed 3 people, is eligible for, has been granted parole?
Well, I'm certainly not going to defend the rationality of all of this. And I know you wanted to take the police out of it, but the truth is that people who commit both of those kinds of crimes are paroled every day without the blowback.
You know, crime in general is an incredibly emotional issue. Violent crime, even more so. And it's completely understandable to me why people, whether they're police or just victims, or, have amazingly strong emotional reactions to crime. And partly that's why, that sort of emotion in the field of criminal justice has largely driven our crime policy in the United States for decades. It's one of the reasons we have mass incarceration, because, anger about crime is turned into longer and longer sentences, and people are in prison for longer.
Right.
I know we'll eventually get to aging prisoners. So the emotion on the one hand is completely understandable. If it was me, I'd be emotional too in any of these cases. But the fact of the matter is, while you have to take that into consideration, crime policy can't only be made on the basis of emotion. There has to be some rationality, some concern for public safety, issues of redemption and human dignity, and just a very sort of targeted concern about, if it costs a lot of money to house, I'm not talking about these particular cases now, but to house people for years and years in prison, and is that really the best way to get public safety? And I think the answer on that is it isn't, right? So it's a very complicated issue, and the philosophical debates here are real and they're legitimate, and I respect people's opinions about it. I mean, in this case, I think you have to respect the decision, but I get the debates, but there's a larger issue here of how is crime policy made and carried out in a fair and effective way without undue influence on any side from the politics here.
But is it possible to have a rational decision-making process that results in certain prisoners not ever being released from prison? Or does that mean that the process was inherently irrational if that's the result?
I don't know that we can make it completely rational. One of my concerns is that we don't do very much for the victims. And one of the reasons we keep feeding this desire for more punishment is because we don't take care of them. We did not wait until we caught Osama bin Laden before the people who were victimized in the World Trade Center bombing got reached out to and helped and supported to deal with it. So part of what we lose in this whole conversation is that a lot of the reason there's so much of this feeling is that we're not taking care of people that are affected by crime. Lots of people are. And so I think, yes, it is irrational. I don't know we can make it completely irrational. Your point about Judith Clark was right. They were different parole commissioners. And you can make a very strong argument that on one day you have 3 commissioners that come to one conclusion and another. Judy's co-defendant was released over 15 years ago. But at the same time, the people that released her were excoriated in the press and ultimately pushed out of the parole board. And that's my concern, is that we politicize the process. It makes it more difficult for people to make fair decisions.
And it is hard, as you're saying. It is irrational in some ways. It's very hard to try to insert a level of rationality in what's inherently an irrational system, right? I mean, the philosophical backbone of parole was supposed to be, you have these objective folks who are sort of experts, who are not influenced one way or another, and they make a judgment on whether it's time and safe to release somebody. What has happened, for all the obvious reasons, is that process has become politicized. They're incredibly influenced by politics. And I said before, if you look at rates of parole, they go up or down in election cycles. And
right.
so, once you have that, it is sort of an irrational process. And I think it's totally legitimate to look at, not just any one particular case, to look at this and think, is there a better way? Is there a better way either to insulate those folks about making decisions that are not so political and suffer so much blowback? Or do you want to go to different kinds of sentencing schemes that just say up front, here's, even though you lose something by doing that, here's what you're going to get, here's the deal, here's when you're going to get out, and there is no parole. Those to me are legitimate policy debates, but it is the problem with parole in practice, maybe not in theory, is that it's very, very sort of cyclical and attuned to politics in a way it shouldn't be.
But separate from that, it's in our culture that we've fed people this notion that all bad things have to be punished, and the only punishment we have to offer at this point is prison, rather than having people think about people changing and what's possible. It's really too bad. I've said this before, the Australians got the criminals, we got the Puritans, and we are set with this concept of punishment that is separate which case it is. It's like, as long as we believe that the only way to respond to bad behavior and to take it serious, and if we're serious about it, that we keep people in for incredibly long sentences, no matter what the sentencing scheme is, we have to deal with that culture we have around violence and punishment. It's very lethal.
These are real cases and understandably emotional and deserve debate. It's important to remember these kinds of cases, someone that kills 3 cops, someone who participates in a terrorist act. These are 0.0001% of the kinds of cases that are in our systems, right? They're outliers.
Right.
They raise all sorts of important issues, but it's also important not to sort of locate those arguments in the arguments about why tens of thousands of people.
But one of the things that can
go
happen,
in,
and we've seen it happen, I think, is if in some of these extreme cases, folks are released and there's a public outcry, there's a political outcry, but police officers are upset and carry out campaigns, and then that has an impact on other cases that are not as extreme.
Correct.
Whereas if they had been kept in prison, we could have minimized that to some extent. Now, I thought that we were going to talk about aging prisoners in the criminal justice system, but we have not gotten to that. So in the last 30 seconds or so that we have on the show, what do we think about this idea of rehabilitation as opposed to punishment? Do we think that prisoners can be rehabilitated, and are we moving in that direction or away from it in our society?
Well, first of all, we know that they can. There's thousands of people get released every year and show rehabilitation. The issue around aging is the same issue, though, because people who are getting old in prison have done a lot of time. And they're not making parole, and it relates back to the punishment paradigm about the fact that they're sitting there and they are aging in prison, because, not because we don't think they can be rehabilitated, because you can ask any superintendent, warden running any prison as who they think should go out and would be safe. And it's those aging prisoners who are not being paroled because of the same reason that Herman raised.
Well, what we're going to have to do is have you guys come back, do a show about aging prisoners. So we have run out of time. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. Les Payne was a friend of mine and a great friend of this show. And I always found that to be especially fortunate because he was a great journalist. So there were many reasons for dismay and terrific sadness when I learned that he had died, unexpectedly, of a heart attack at the age of 76. Les spent most of his career at Newsday, where he was a reporter, foreign correspondent, columnist, and associate managing editor. And that was where he was when he won the Pulitzer Prize as part of a team that tracked the trail of heroin from the harvesting of poppies in Turkey to the illicit sales on the streets of New York. On top of everything else, Les was a great family man. So our hearts go out to his wife Violet, their children, and the many others who loved and cherished Les Payne. That's all for now. See you next time.